In today's lesson, we're going to explore, is there a Mars-Earth connection? After looking at the structures on Mars, there's clear evidence that there's possibly artificial structures on the surface of Mars. Now, these would have to date to thousands of years in our past. It might coincide with this lost advanced technological civilization that modern history refers to as Atlantis, might have been not only a global civilization, as we're uncovering by looking at the megalithic sites around the world, but could have also have possibly been an off-planet civilization based on the similarity to the structures that we see in the Cydonia region with the face and pyramids. So in today's lesson, we're going to dive into the Mars-Earth connection and see that, in fact, there is some type of relationship beyond just the face and the Sphinx and the pyramids, where there's a Giza-Cydonia connection. What we also see is that Mars has a extensive history of being a very Earth-like planet. For whatever reason, mostly political backup, NASA and the other space agencies aren't making this headline news. But as you're going to see in today's lesson, there is definitely something being covered up about the surface of Mars. Now, most of you are familiar with the movie Stargate and remember, the infamous idea of uncovering some piece of lost ancient technology found in Giza or one of these types of locations and allows us to kind of travel to other worlds. This might not be too far from the facts when we look at what we find at some of these sites, like Giza, like Cydonia, and some of the ways that they describe information talking about this connection with other celestial bodies, like the Mars-Earth connection. Maybe it is possible that we can wormhole into another location, whether it's in our solar system or another, and find similar structures to what we have here in our solar system. But what we have are artifacts left all over the Earth that really raise a lot of questions. Now, the Sphinx has a much older history than what we might realize. We really don't know the true age of the Sphinx. When it was discovered in the early 1900s, excavated at least, or I should say re-excavated, all of the sands, as you can see, used to cover up the Sphinx. And it took quite a bit of effort to scrape away all this sand to what you see now as a tourist attraction. And there have been quite a few facelifts, as you can tell by the strata of the paws here versus this older strata. But what's really interesting about the Sphinx is the dating. Now, if we attribute the Egyptian cultures to building the Sphinx and pyramids, we're talking around 2500 BC. But the evidence geologically stacks up in a much older date. All the evidence around the Sphinx, as far as the geological evidence, we see extensive water erosion, like it's been just heavily poured on by water. Now, the last time that it was raining in the Giza Plateau was 10,000 years ago. So this really raises a lot of questions. Now, what we also see is the architecture, the alignment and placement of these objects. The pyramids and the way they were placed have great significance. And we've been able to prove this based on the, alignments of these structures to positions in the sky. We know now for a fact that the Giza pyramids, with the third pyramid slightly offset, you can see how these corners are perfectly matched, then this one is slightly offset. Well, that's exactly an emulation of the Orion constellation. If anyone looks up at the Orion constellation in the night sky, you see 3 stars with the topmost one slightly offset. Somehow, Giza was built as a terrestrial map, emulating the sky at 10,500 BC. So what we're seeing is a clear connection to an advanced culture that possibly is the real builders of the pyramids, not the Egyptians in 2500 BC. Or maybe the Egyptians did build the pyramids. We really don't know. And they were pointing to a much older epoch of time. But all the evidence, geologically as well as the new information we're decoding about these astronomical markers, monuments, and even edifices and hieroglyphics that reference what the skies look like above the skies of Giza, well before 2500 BC. We're talking 10,500 BC and even before that. And this is a clear pattern. It's not just in Giza. The three pyramids of Giza, the structures at Teotihuacan, and even in China are all possibly emulating this Orion constellation, this time of using Orion as a marker to pinpoint in this grand cycle of time, using the zodiacal breakdown of the heavens, the 12 constellations that we know of today as the 12 houses of the zodiac. That's like a large celestial clock, and we can use that as well as other markers like the Orion constellation and see when these alignments take place. So this is something that you're going to continue to see us bring forth in these lessons, is that we're using astronomical data, points in space where these alignments repeat, as a way to accurately date sites like Teotihuacan and Giza and others that we can't carbon date without any type of biological material. We're using celestial, astronomical means to date them. We combine that with geological evidence, looking at strata and different changes in geology, and we're on to a new type of science to learn about our past. So understand that the astronomical data is very key, and that there are alignments across the globe to points in space. Orion is one that keeps coming up. So is Sirius. We're going to cover that in another lecture, though. Now, I definitely want to take off my hat to a couple of scholars, Zachariah Sitchin one, Graham Hancock another, that help further expose this lost information about Giza and this connection with the astronomical alignments and positioning of monuments around the world. There is a great base of knowledge from the scholars that we currently have available that are opening the veil to this information. Unfortunately, Zachariah Sitchin just passed away. I'm sure Graham will be around for quite a while, but grasp this knowledge while you can. Now let's switch gears again slightly and look back to this Mars-Earth connection and realize that Mars, while it looks to be a dead, barren planet, has a much more interesting base of evidence that we're now starting to uncover, which could show possible signs of life, harboring the means to support life today. We know that in the Cydonia region that there are these structures that have caused quite a bit of controversy over the last couple of decades. This area called Cydonia, where there's what appears to be an ancient shoreline, for one. It's not just a random collection of objects that people theorize are pyramid, or a face. There's more than meets the eye here, folks. Pay attention. Look at the geological evidence from this bright, knobby terrain to this darker, mellow terrain. Actually, I'm going to probably jump forward a few slides and touch on this again, but I want to at least point it out now, that realize there is an ancient shoreline that you can clearly see from bright, knobby terrain that contains all of the possible structures that were an ancient city. But then here, in this darker area, we see the face, which was possibly situated in water. Sitting out on the shoreline, visible from the structures on the shore, a large face, an edifice that could be seen in the water. We'll come back to that point. But now again, look at the geometrical connections, the geometry of angles and repeating consistency that we have with the face, the D&M pyramid, the city, and other areas, other structures nearby. There is too much math to just be coincidence, naturally. There's been quite a bit of evidence calculated from the Enterprise mission. There's been quite a bit of evidence looked at by the Enterprise mission in a mathematical sense. Leading that research is Richard Hoagland, and you can see that all the repeating algorithms of numbers that we see that just make these too unlikely to be a natural phenomenon. I definitely recommend anyone interested in this Mars-Earth connection further look into the research by Richard Hoagland. He produced a couple videos that I kind of think of as cliff notes to get you up to pace rather than reading a 600-page book, The Monuments of Mars, which is also a great book. But Richard Hoagland put out a couple of videos that are very helpful in further understanding this topic. So again, you can see here, again, just some of the main areas we're talking about: the city, the face, the D&M pyramid, which was labeled after Vincent DiPietro and Greg Molinar, who went through extensive NASA archives and found this frame reference where the sun angle is hitting the face at a different angle. I brought this up before, folks. The sun is hitting the face at a different angle, and it's still, no matter what angle this shadow appears, it always looks like a face. It's a three-dimensional representation of a humanoid face. And around it, structures that appear to be an ancient city, ancient pyramids, some type of intelligently built hillside, some scraped away cliff. Lots of questions around this region. And you can see through this artist's rendition that, some of these structures, again, could have been literal extraterrestrial, or at least some type of ancient city off planet. Too much symmetry to just be discounted. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we did see some type of terrain change that I've labeled land and water, and you can see here that the terrain change happens right on what appears to be a shoreline. All of the structures of interest, even this one that we pointed out recently, all of these that are pyramidal, the fort, this large pyramid, are all contained on what appears to be a landmass. Now, again, if we look at this from another angle, again, land, water, clear terrain change, right as if there's an ancient shoreline separating the structures from what you can clearly see becomes a more non-knobby, mellow terrain, and the face surrounded by water. This is exactly what we have on Earth. Everyone loves waterfront property, whether it's on the ocean, lake, waterfront property. Why wouldn't that exist on another planet? That's exactly how this was built. All of the structures appear to be on the landmass, and the face is situated like the Statue of Liberty, right? It's a monument for everyone to memorialize. This can't be a coincidence, folks. There is a Mars-Earth connection. Now, when the face was first discovered, they labeled it head. This was in 1976, and NASA quickly said that, oh, it's a trick of light and shadow, because the angle of the sun was hitting it here, and we looked at it under different missions, and when the lighting angle changed, the shadow was here, here, here. It no longer looked like a face. Wrong answer. So all of the evidence that we've shown clearly suggests that this face is a three-dimensional object, and that when we look at it under further analysis by taking what we have available, even though it's a badly eroded, sculpted object, we can clearly see that the face is something there, and it has what we appear to call lion-like Sphinx Egyptian characteristics. This can't be coincidence, folks. But it goes beyond just what we've seen here on the face and pyramids. Again, the geological evidence. Most of the things that we're now deploying to Mars are coming from other space agencies. NASA's space agency is kind of shutting down. So we now have the European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, all deploying satellites with very advanced imaging capability. And subpar from what we've seen from NASA up to this point, they always produce black and white footage of the surface of Mars. Well, we now get color data from the other space agencies. And overlaying those with what NASA's been taking photos of, we see things on the surface of Mars that are really starting to raise a lot of questions from the geological point of view. Let's dive in. Now, as we've seen in this one area on Mars, NASA shows one thing, ESA shows something else. What we see in the Gusev crater in color appears to be living vegetation, plant life on the surface of Mars. If we look at it from NASA's camera, this is what we see in that same set of longitude and latitude at the Gusev crater. Oily streaks, dark lines. What are those? They could be possibly vegetation, but we don't know. In color, much more interesting. So a lot of these sites are raising questions. And if we go through the archives of information from NASA, We can see that even from the Viking footage in the 70s, landing on the surface of Mars, and there's frost, liquid water, frozen, all over the surface of Mars. That should be very clear in answering the question, is there water on Mars? But it goes even further. If you look at the imagery that we have from Mars, this one versus this one, look at my captions here at the bottom. Every time we take pictures on the surface of Mars, we're using a lens that captures a much broader spectrum of light than what the human eye processes. If you were to stand on the surface of Mars, this is what the surface of Mars looks like. They never color correct the imagery for the human eye. Or do they? Every now and then you'll see a slip up. Here's a live conference that was done around the Pathfinder mission several years ago. This is what we're familiar with seeing on Mars. But lo and behold, in this one conference, Mars looks more like Earth. And this is something we see over and over, which is a simple understanding that if you color correct any of the imagery that we have from the surface of Mars, it looks like this. Mars is not like what we see as this red barren planet. It might be much more hospitable to life than we're currently being told. But why? Now, all of the evidence, again, folks, if we color correct the imagery and look at the same types of minerals and debris of rocks and things that we have as sediments on Earth and compare those to the color tones once color corrected on Earth, we see much more of a harmonious balance between our two atmospheres. Even though Mars's atmosphere might not be that dense, everything we're starting to find out shows it probably was just as dense as Earth in the past. This raises a lot of questions. What is Mars currently like today? Maybe with a lighter atmosphere, there is still the ability to harbor life. And when we look at more of the signs for what's needed to harbor life, it's showing up across the spectrum on Mars. Not only are there signs of a clear flowing water, but possibly saltwatery oceans. And this is literally the basis for amino acids and prokaryotes and simple life forms that eventually evolved from the oceans into the shore and became more advanced creatures. Now, that doesn't jump to the human evolution story, but what we're seeing on Mars is all the evidence to point to the fact that everything is in place for life to exist and to have evolved on the surface of Mars. Everything that we look at shows us to be ancient shorelines and ancient lake beds and the same type of sedimentary debris that we have on Earth is showing up here, is showing up also on Mars. Now, there was recently something kicked off the rover as this little debris shows just from a few days change that here you can see a piece of the rover. There's this, all of a sudden, this shiny rock and everyone's like, wow, what is it? It's an alien or some type of, alien artifact. It was probably something just bumped off the rover. But understand that we have the ability to monitor the public space agencies on a pretty much weekly basis for geological evidence and changes, which might not be their primary mission, but anyone interested in space sciences can track these and find some very interesting new revealing data that might help your own research. So again, while this isn't an alien rock, it is interesting to note that there are changes that happen on a frequent basis around current space missions, and that you can literally be a part of these changes and analyze what's really going on. Now, a lot of this, again, focuses on very questionable topics that are strong implications. Now, what we're seeing here is possibly standing water on the surface of Mars. All the geological evidence points to the fact that this was once flowing water. Are we seeing standing water that's currently there now? When we compare the surface of what we see on Mars, this is literally on Mars, folks. It looks to be standing water. And we can compare this geologically with what we see on areas on Earth. Again, to me, we're seeing vegetation and standing water on the surface of Mars. And this is current imagery that we're getting from NASA archives. When we compare these of things that we can look at from Google Earth in color, Mars and Earth seem to be much more in alignment than all the static imagery that we have in our old books and things that have put this label as Mars as a dead planet. Folks, that's just not the case. Everything that our new sciences are showing us, Mars and Earth are a lot closer than we have appeared to have been told. So just again, look at the raw data here, and you can see when my cursor goes over this image that I'm actually showing you a link that this is coming from where? Malin Space Science Systems, located in San Diego, as I've mentioned before. When they covered the face in Cydonia, that imagery doesn't look too good. But this, looking at ancient lake beds and possibly actual living vegetation, it's quite clear that what we're seeing is real data, that Mars is still a living planet. Now, we can compare the structures of what we see on Mars, which these could be natural formations, but maybe not. What is this? Some kind of oily debris? Or is this some type of living bacteria? Is this an ancient city similar to what we see on Earth? Ancient Inca cities on Mars similar to what we see on Earth? I don't know, folks, but the vegetation style around the cities and everything that we see similarity-wise between Mars and Earth, if anyone's paying attention, really should raise a lot of questions. Okay, so again, if we just look at some of the evidence of what our planet looks like from a satellite view and compare that to some of the things that we see on Mars, some of these cities, whether they're current or ancient, really start to raise a lot of questions when we look at some of the evidence on Mars that might contain actual ancient cities. Aztec, Mayan, again, more than just the Egyptian Cydonia connection, but other cultures that are somehow tapping into this lost, advanced technological society that might have existed not just on our planet, but in other planets in our own solar system. So everything that we're starting to see on Mars, again, this is just a cliffside on Mars. Look more closely. What is that? Is that possibly a pharaonic type pharaoh or something carved into the rock bed? We don't really know. But a lot of these things are starting to pop up. And I think if we were to send someone to Mars, actual human beings to do some exploration, things would be pointed out and seen to us that the robots and the rovers currently now are not picking up or are not able to identify as they just scurry by. So a lot of the depictions of what we see in these ancient cultures, the way their cities were built, some of the references that they use, we can start to look on other planets, literally the one right next door to us, Mars, and see that there's some type of connection between many of our lost ancient cultures. Some of the artifacts that we look at in Egypt, show what appear to be spacecraft, helicopters, literally gliders and things that would allow this type of cross-planet communication to take place. As far-fetched as it might seem, we as ancient explorers have to consider all of the evidence. And all the evidence is pointing to the fact that there is a much deeper history than just what we have here on Earth. Now, some of these hieroglyphs or depictions are shown across culture. One of them obviously is the winged disc. This is an ancient Sumerian seal, and you can see here that it actually has a depiction of Earth, the 7 dots and our crescent moon, and Mars, and talking about how even in ancient Iraq, Mesopotamia, Babylon, as we discussed, this ancient Sumerian culture, they literally depicted that their gods, these Anunnaki, traveled between Mars and Earth. So it wasn't just the Egyptians. There was also other cultures that seemed to have reference of Mars, and what we would call mythological information might have a basis in technology as well, as we further decipher this lost information. Now, a lot of these depictions of the ancient Sumerian gods, the Anunnaki, and depicting them with flight, again, put into perspective the idea that they had the power of flight, and that could have meant they could have been coming and going from other planets, not just flying in the skies of Earth. So we have to understand that even today, the possibility that Mars could harbor life could be subterranean life. It's not just the surface of Mars with its weak atmosphere, which is very questionable just on the evidence we just reviewed, lakes and lost cities and things that could possibly still harbor life on the city, dome-like structures covering them and creating their own atmosphere. We don't know. But there's clear evidence that there could be subterranean or into the caverns or craters where you might want to create a dome-like city. Just like on the back side of the moon, there is the very strong possibility that there is life on Mars now. We just need to look in the right places. Now, people need to realize that there is a much deeper history in exploring these topics about life on other planets and NASA's actual protocols for what happens if they do find aliens or a UFO. Please understand, folks, that there was something called the Brookings Institute, and literally when NASA was first conceived in the late 50s, they consulted this large think tank called the Brookings Institute, who compiled a very large report based on what would happen if they were ever, NASA, to discover from bacterial life all the way up to intelligent extraterrestrials, the ramifications to our society, our politics, our economic system. So all of that is a legacy of information that's still in place and governs our decisions today. So when we look at structures on Mars or other planets and realize that these possible artificial structures, as amazing as this may seem, folks, it's now time to accept this information. There have been procedures and things in place, like the Brookings Institute and the Brookings Report, that have been governing our procedures for how we venture into space and explore these topics that are well overdue for a revamp. Visiting these in the 1950s versus 2014, I think we all should have a fresh view from looking at our past and understanding where we're going to go in the future. Stay tuned.